What do you do when you hear a noise in your house? You could write it off as your imagination. After all, we tell ourselves that it's better to be safe than sorry. But what if the sound comes again and again, and you can't ignore it anymore? Where do you go from there? Do you start to search for an explanation? Or do you simply try to drown out the unsettling sounds by turning up the TV volume? Well, today we have a creepy story about someone who hears a sound under their bed and tries to investigate. It's our story, Whispers Under the Bed. It was getting late and you could see the exhaustion weighing down on Jessica's shoulders. She needed to move soon, but she didn't want to leave her things behind. That's why she was still sitting on her bed taking inventory. She had moved into this house only a few weeks ago, but she already hated staying here alone at night. It always felt like she wasn't alone. The house had been her grandmother's before it was hers, and when Jessica inherited it, she decided to turn the spare bedroom into her home office. Now it was finally ready, but she was too scared to spend the night here. Every night when the clock struck 12, she would hear strange whispers in her room. At first, it hadn't bothered her because she had headphones on. But now she was considering canceling her work session for the next day and spending the night at her boyfriend S' place instead. After all, the whispers were driving her insane. They sounded like people talking in hushed tones. She couldn't make out any words, but she could definitely hear many voices discussing matters just outside her room. Of course, she told herself that this was silly. There was no way that there were people hiding outside her room, talking right next to the wall. Her rational mind understood that the walls were probably just thin, allowing her to hear her neighbors talk. But even that seemed unlikely since she hadn't heard anything during the daytime. But one night, Jessica woke up in the middle of the night and heard her name being whispered. Startled, she sat upright on her bed and tried to listen closely. Yes, they were whispering her name. Jessica, they said, and then the whispers continued again, even though she knew that she should get over it. Her curiosity got the best of her. So once the whispers started again, Jessica swung her legs out of bed and walked over to the corner where her bed was positioned. As she strained to listen under the bed, she realized that she had never really looked underneath it since moving in. So she took her phone out of her pocket and turned on its flashlight. She didn't expect to find anything, but she did notice a small patch of damp, dark wood on the underside of her bed. She wasn't sure if she should touch it or not, but as she slowly extended her finger toward it, the whispering suddenly stopped. Startled by the sudden silence, she quickly retracted her hand and stood frozen on the spot. She had never expected her bed to have anything to do with the whispering. And now that she had disturbed whatever was happening, the voices had stopped. What should she do, she wondered. Did she want to find out more? When she realized that there was nothing else to do, she bent down again, this time pressing her whole palm against the dark patch of wood. Jessica wanted to find out what was going on. If it was mold, maybe she could paint over it or scrape it away. But when she pressed her hand against the underside of the bed, she immediately regretted it. It wasn't mold at all. It was a gaping hole in the wood, and her fingers could feel the moist, humid air coming from inside of it. Jessica's face drained of color, and she scrambled backward. She fell onto the floor and curled into a ball. But as she listened intently, she realized that the whispering had started again, but now it was closer. Jessica stared at the black opening in her bed in horror. She knew that she should call out for help, but her throat was dry and she couldn't get any words out. She wanted to get away from the bed, but her feet seemed glued to the floor. And then she heard a new voice. It seemed to come from above her. "Don't look down again," the voice whispered. But Jessica's eyes were fixed on the dark hole in her bed. She had so many questions, but no one was there to answer them. Suddenly, the whispers intensified. Jessica cried out and threw her hands in front of her ears. The voices kept rising, and it felt like they were sucking the oxygen out of the room. Jessica's vision blurred, and she couldn't breathe. All she could think about was running away, escaping from this room and never coming back. When she finally managed to pull herself together, she fled to the bathroom and locked the door behind her. Sitting on the toilet, she tried to calm her breathing, but the whispers followed her even here. Panting, she looked around the room for a way out, but there wasn't one. The window was locked from the outside. As the voices continued their eerie chant, Jessica remembered her phone lying on her bed. She had to call someone, anyone. But how could she get back to her room without braving the whispers? She thought about calling out for help, but that would only attract unwanted attention. Taking a deep breath, Jessica steeled herself and crept back to her room. She grabbed her phone and ran back to the safety of the bathroom. Once she had the phone in her hands, she called her boyfriend. As she waited for him to pick up the phone, Jessica noticed that the whispering had stopped. Maybe she had imagined the whole thing, she thought. But then the line went dead. Had he hung up on her? Why would he? Unless he was as scared as she was. Suddenly, the whispers started again, but they weren't coming from under her bed. They were coming from her closet. The closet was attached to her bedroom, which had a sliding door. Jessica could have sworn that she had closed it earlier, but now it was slightly ajar. Her boyfriend was on the other end of the line, and she could hear his confused voice asking her what was wrong. But Jessica couldn't speak. She couldn't bring out a single word, because the voices in her closet were rising, and they were getting angrier. Jessica's blood ran cold. The voices weren't just whispering anymore. They were screaming at the top of their lungs, and the sound was terrifying. When she finally pulled herself together, the room was silent again. She could hear her boyfriend's worried voice on the other end of the line. He was telling her to unlock the door, but she didn't. She was still listening for more noises. When she was sure that everything was quiet, she unlocked the door and cautiously opened it. She was relieved to see that her boyfriend standing there with a worried expression on his face. She opened her mouth to explain, but he stepped inside the room before she could say anything. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the bed, and then he turned back to her. "What happened?" he asked. "Were you attacked? Are you hurt?" Jessica shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't explain what had happened. How could she possibly tell him about the voices? He would think that she was crazy. She spent the rest of the night at her boyfriend's house, and the next morning she packed most of her things and left the house empty. She never looked back. Have you ever heard whispers when nobody was around? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We hope you enjoyed this story. If you want to hear another one, Stay tuned for more content.